You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars. Hello everybody, today, hot on the heels of my Corolla T-Sport review, I'm driving yet another forgotten Japanese hot hatch, the Yaris T-Sport. I have said on a number of occasions that I believe the late 90s and early noughties were really a golden period for the hot hatchback. That I still believe, but it is also true that Toyota, the world's largest automaker at many points in history, has had a little bit of a distant and very on-off relationship with the genre. Off the back of my Corolla T-Sport review, I've been offered a number of cars in very much the same vein, and the first one I wanted to try was this, the Yaris T-Sport, for a couple of reasons. First, its owner Sam was adamant that it is one of the most fun cars he's ever driven, and he's had many of the hot hatch greats: 205 GTI, 106 GTI, Civic EP3. This is also the car which brought the T-Sport brand to the world, was the first ever vehicle sold with that badging. However, if you were to look at it, you might think that it seems a bit of a missed opportunity, but there's a very good reason for that. The figure most people when buying a hot hatch will look at is horsepower, and this has just 105 of them. Unlike the first generation Corolla T-Sport though, Toyota did seem to put a little bit more effort into this one. So you've got bespoke bumpers, front and rear, newer, more aggressive side skirts, even this little wind deflector is actually a genuine Toyota item, as is the very diminutive but still quite nice rear wing on the back. However, the little weird carbon fibre eyebrows on the wing mirrors are not, and I'm not sure I've ever seen eyebrows on wing mirrors before. Seen them on headlights, seen them on people, even seen them on dogs, but never ever on wing mirrors. This apparently does serve a real purpose, and when it's particularly damp out, it does make things just a little bit better, improves side visibility. You got discs all round versus the discs and drums of the regular model. You had a lower and stiffer chassis that sat 20mm below the regular car, a close ratio 5-speed gearbox, and even the body shell was stiffened too. The cooking version of the Yaris was also fairly well received. It was introduced in 1999, even won Car of the Year. But it wasn't for another 2 years that Toyota actually introduced this sporty version. With all of those upgrades and Toyota's sporting pedigree, the fact they were introducing a whole new nameplate, you would have thought that they would have given this a slightly spicier engine. The 1.5-litre VVTi 4-cylinder lump up front certainly has plenty of character and should be quite zingy, I'm told, from around 4,000 RPM. But outright firepower is never going to impress. Being small in displacement and with no forced induction, torque is also relatively modest. 145 Nm is what Toyota quote, that's about 106 pound-foot in old money. I said though that there was some logic to Toyota's decision, and it was one that several other manufacturers also made. The 80s and 90s were a rather wild time to be a car fan here in Britain. You had a plethora of more powerful than ever before cars available at reasonable prices. Things from fast forwards like your Escort RS Cosworths to the new brace of Japanese machinery that was making its way here. A very favourable exchange rate also meant that it was extremely cheap to import some of these cars. But, as the citizens of Essex or Rotherham might tell you, with great power comes great irresponsibility. The max power scene was at its absolute peak. People were racing in the streets, often in cars they hadn't properly or fully insured. And just about every Tom, Dick or Barry who owned a Saxo VTS or an Escort Cosy either crashed it, had it nicked, or both. It got to a point where even a sensible, upstanding member of society would struggle to insure some of these cars, with prices quoted for a year's worth of cover often being more than the value of the entire vehicle. I believe it's with one of the faster Fords, perhaps even the Cozzy, that the average number of insurance claims on each car was 1.6, meaning that statistically speaking, if you had one of those cars, you were going to crash it or it was going to get nicked. It was a statistical certainty. This meant that come the noughties, manufacturers weren't struggling to build the cars, but they were struggling to find people who could actually insure them. Even when I got my driving license, I still remember one of the key selling points for a lot of smaller cars was the fact that they would chuck a year's worth of insurance in. This car is a prime example of what you would have termed the warm hatchback. But can it still put a smile on your face despite a lack of ponies? Let's find out. Out that it can. It's not a perfect vehicle. This will surprise absolutely nobody, particularly as the perfect car does not exist, just like the perfect person, with the exception, of course, of Heather Graham. This car, in the tradition of any small hatch aimed at young people, isn't entirely standard. It has some genuine TTE wheels on it, which I think do look rather nice. It also has a fruity stainless steel exhaust from the manifold back with a high-flow cat in. And actually, it sounds really rather good. Turning circle, let's try that. Is okay, if not spectacular. The controls are all reasonably light, not an awful lot of feel through any of the pedals, but once you've worked out where the biting point of the clutch is, a little higher than I was expecting, it's actually fine. The steering is fairly light, the cabin is pretty simply laid out. It's not very high-end, but that's because this wasn't a very expensive car. £12,000 when new, and today you can pick an example up from about 2 to 4. You do have air conditioning, which is very nice to see, and probably just as important to some as the power figure, on a run you'll get about 41 to the gallon. Even doing some fun stuff, I'm still getting 34.5 as an average. That's pretty darn good. Let's have a little bit more of a play, shall we? It's rare that I can say this with a straight face, but at no point today in this car have I breached the speed limit. And yet still, you can really enjoy this car, because to make even modest progress, you do really need to drive it and wring its neck. To some, I think that would be tiring. To others, though, highly enjoyable. Which side of the fence you're on, really, is up to you. Having only the 5 ratios in the box means that I think on the motorway, it could be just a little bit tiresome. That being said, the custom exhaust is better judged than I might have expected. This was never a car that was going to win awards for its refinement, though. Interior space is also reasonably limited. Up front, it's not really a problem, but the back seats are fairly cramped. You might just about get 4 adults in here because the rear seats do move. They'll slide backwards and forwards, and they'll even tilt out the way. This was very important for Sam because he wanted a car that was large enough to fit his dog. Now, I know what you'll think. You'll look at something like this and think, what is it? Chihuahua, Springer Spaniel, Jack Russell maybe? No, it's a Doberman. Believe it or not, you can actually fit a Doberman in its cage in the back of a Yaris T-Sport, and it won't want to kill you when you let it out. The other non-standard item about this car is the suspension. So it's currently got some teen lowering springs. The dampers are standard. Sam did inquire about changing those, but he was told the items Toyota fit are already of pretty high quality. The interior layout is also what I would describe as funky. If anything, if you dropped me in here and made me guess what kind of car I was in, I might be tempted to say French. The only real giveaways that it's Japanese are the very classic Toyota little fuel filler release on the floor and the indicator stalks, which definitely feel 1990s Japanese car. The instrument binnacle up here is very basic, but it also tells you everything you need to know. The speedo goes up to only 130 mile an hour, which is fine because this car will not go up to 130 mile an hour. It might though once Sam's done with it, because one of his plans for this car is to supercharge it. I have actually seen a Vitz supercharged. The Vitz is what they call the Yaris in Japan, and I do believe that may have been a factory item, but internet hive mind, if I'm wrong on that one, please do correct me. By default, this car actually came with both tape and CD, and humorously, although it's now got a later head unit in it, the CD slot is actually still there. Not so much storage in the door bins. Matt Watson would be very disappointed. Back on the fun bit, let's talk a little bit more about the dynamics. So power, I think, is actually ample. Yes, it's only 105 horses, but it's also only 960 kilos. That means you can make decent enough progress. You sit very high in this car. The dash and windows both feel reasonably low. Unlike a Fiat 500 though, I don't get the sensation that this wants to tip all the time. If anything, you can tell that when the car does reach the limit of adhesion, and it's only on Uniroyal Rain Sports, so they're not exactly cup to R's, it will just wash wide a little bit. And that's absolutely fine. That's really what you want. You do not want one of these trying to break away from the rear, because with a wheelbase as short as this, that's going to end very badly. The steering is a little slower than I might like it. I tend to prefer a more Italian setup of a very fast off-centre response. In truth, this car is now of an age where it's likely to need some fresher bushings and things like that, and those probably will sharpen up the handling. In spite of that, though, it's actually very pleasant. The car gives you reasonable confidence to push on, and when you are on a bend, the steering does take on a reasonably nice weighting. The gear shift is pretty good too, although not Toyota's best. There's a little bit of slack in this. The lever itself is really quite long, but kind of has to be to get it where you want it. I'm not a big fan of the little TTE adornment on the top though. That just doesn't work for me. It's not my style. But Sam likes it. That's what's important. The shift throw is actually a lot shorter than you might expect it to be. It's got a reasonable amount of snicket to it, which is a very fine and desirable quality in any gearbox, but it lacks that finesse and precision of some of Toyota's best. This, like the steering, I suspect, can easily be improved. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the car has been quite reliable, but more surprisingly, it also hasn't started to rust. This seems to be one of the things that kills many a fine Japanese car, particularly anything from the 90s and earlier. Even S2000s suffer from it, but this is doing thus far pretty well. And cars like this all tended to have a reasonably hard life. These are the sort of thing that if you're thinking about buying, I would advise, say, an RAC type inspection. Taking them to a specialist I don't think is particularly necessary, and it's a service like that that should hopefully tell you if what you're about to buy into is actually a lemon. Speaking of which, they had 5 colours available for these, and they even had an exclusive one called Thunder Grey. So nothing particularly outlandish. Thunder Grey in England is virtually the equivalent of active camouflage for 4 months of the year. With this car, Sam has actually done something incredibly sensible and unbelievably rare. He's asked himself the very honest question of what does he actually need or want from a car, and he's bought the car that does that, with no prejudice about the badge on the front, what people will think, and so on. So in his case, he went looking for something that was going to be a bit of fun on the B roads, but also had enough space for the dog, was going to be cheap and reliable. This is all of those things, and it does happen to be, when you want it, quite a lot of fun. Though the ride can be a little bit choppy, maybe even crashy at moments, it's still a lot better than, say, the Ford Racing Puma that I drove last year. And even at 2,000 or 3,000 RPM, the car actually has really impressive pickup. The one piece of this puzzle you'd think was lacking, the engine, actually turns out to be almost a star. If you can go through there, giving it the beans, a car's reasonably well set up. A lot of lowered stuff will just smash into the ground. This did not. Very impressed. Had any of my friends bought one of these about 15 years ago, the first thing they would have done was not put any carbon fibre stuff on or a different shift lever. They'd have been straight down Halfords and spent about 500 quid on a stereo that would have been awful. The only other car I think I've driven in recent times that is roughly equivalent to this will be the Citroen C2 Code, spun off the VTS, which has similar power to this, similar sizing and everything else. If you were to make me choose between the two, I would certainly have the Toyota any day of the week. And yes, the reason for that is as simple as one is made by Toyota and the other is made by Citroen. It just so happens that I think Toyota also put a lot more effort into this car, and it does feel it. The Citroen may be marginally cheaper to buy now, but I would say in overall terms, the Toyota is probably going to be the cheaper car as well. I was talking with Sam earlier and we were discussing how on my channel, I'll drive nearly anything from 100-year-old vintage cars up to the latest Bentley, Ferraris and everything in between. And let's be honest here, everything in between those two things is basically every car ever made. I still haven't done a steam car. That I would very much like to do. However, if you're a young man and you're not handy with a coal shovel, you're on the hunt for something interesting, I would say the Toyota Yaris T-Sport, definitely worth a look. Because I was telling Sam that despite having driven now some of my all-time favourite dream cars, still working on the Carrera GT, one of the things I enjoy the most is cars that I have absolutely no expectations for, or in some cases, negative ones. I don't think I was really expecting this to be a bad car. It was simply one I didn't know anything about. But I'm very glad that I have tried it. That, I think, is enough from me. Thanks to you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment down below, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.